Hello, we have made it to week 14 of the course. There's only 1 week left after this one, so congratulations for getting this far. This week, I've decided to approach the videos by creating two videos, one of which will give a kind of overview of the early Middle Ages, and the second of which will give an overview of what's called the High Middle Ages. There's a lot of history reading in this unit, a lot of material. So I thought the best thing I could offer you in these videos is to give you a big picture view of these two eras that we're looking at, and then I'll leave you to flesh that out as you read. So this video is on the early Middle Ages, which we've, of course, already started to talk about. And we talked about the three major cultural ingredients that made up the particular stew that is early medieval culture. And I'll just remind you, early Middle Ages typically defined as 500 to 1,000. And those three ingredients are Germanic culture, which, of course, began as a kind of pagan culture, Christian culture, and Greco-Roman culture. So we've already talked about that. The early Middle Ages is one of those historical periods that gets a kind of a bad rap. I'm sure you've all heard people talk about the Dark Ages, and it's likely that they're referring to this period in particular. This is a period that used to even be called by historians the Dark Ages, although not necessarily because it was such a dark time to be alive, but because we don't have a whole lot of historical evidence regarding this period. Therefore, it is dark to us. It's hard for us to see what was happening because we've lost so many documents and artifacts and so on. But the point is that I think that this period especially is seen as a low point in Western civilization. There are some reasons for that, but I also want to alert you to another side of the early Middle Ages. There were periods of real cultural fertility and political accomplishment, even though those, can't say, sorry, got a dog who thinks he can dig a hole on our bed. There are periods of sort of rebirth and accomplishment that tend to alternate with periods of chaos and disorder and so on. I think we've already talked about the fact that this is a period of population decline. This is a period in which cities were shrinking or being abandoned altogether. But as real as that side of the picture is, there is another side, and I want to address that in this video. And I want to address that by talking about arguably the greatest political figure of the early Middle Ages, and that is Charlemagne, Charles the Great, who was the king of the Franks from 768 to his death in 814. The Frankish kingdom was already quite large by the time he became king, and he will, in fact, expand that. And that really leads me to my the big question I have about Charlemagne, which is why is he remembered? Why is he considered great? What are his accomplishments? And one of those accomplishments is the annexation of more territory for the kingdom of the Franks. So look at page 211 in West in the World, and you can see exactly the size and the state of the Frankish kingdom when Charlemagne became king in 768. That's the green territory, so you can see it's already quite large. But the territories that are sort of the orange color, those are territories that Charlemagne conquered and claimed for his kingdom. So he had enjoyed great military successes during his reign. And this is really, his kingdom is the largest kingdom ever sort of cobbled together in the early Middle Ages. So that's worth knowing. Another great accomplishment, if you want to see it that way, certainly a notable feat, is the way that he allied himself with the papacy. Famously, you'll read about this, on Christmas Day 800, Charlemagne was crowned emperor, so he's already king, but now he's going to be crowned emperor, and he's crowned emperor by none other than the Pope, Pope Leo III. And this is going to be the beginning of a close but complicated relationship between the king of what will later be called the Holy Roman Empire and the Pope. But the fact of the matter is, he is able to give himself additional prestige and credibility by being brought into this close relationship with the papacy. One last thing I want to say about his reign is that this is seen as a period, perhaps the most exciting period of cultural activity in the entire 500 years that makes up the early Middle Ages. It is such an interesting period from the standpoint of philosophy, theology, art, that this period is often called the Carolingian Renaissance. Carolingian, Carolingin. And that's named after the dynasty of which Charlemagne was a part. He belonged to the Carolingian dynasty, so that's how it got that name. So what exactly happens during this period that leads to this great cultural ferment? Well, Charlemagne himself recruited the top scholars in Europe from far and wide. And I really do mean from far and wide. Probably the most important scholar that he recruits to his court. His court is based in Aachen, 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 which is now in Germany. He recruited Alcuin of York, Alcuin, Alcuin of York. York is in northern England, okay? So he's reaching all the way up into northern England to snag the most talented scholars of his day, to bring them to his court and to oversee education in his realm. And indeed, that was a big emphasis for him, creating a network of good schools. One of the reasons he's concerned about this is because he's rather appalled by the state of the clergy, by the state of the priesthood in his own place and time. There were a number of priests in his kingdom who were barely literate, or not even literate at all. And so he wanted to really revamp the system of education, to produce a more educated clergy. Another task that he commissioned his scholars to work on was to produce corrected manuscripts of important texts, many of which were religious texts. We have to remember that the printing press is still far off in the future at this point. So all books are produced by being copied. And when books are copied over generations and generations and generations, you can imagine what's going to happen. All sorts of errors are going to creep in, or maybe sometimes a sort of overzealous monk might make his own correction to the text. And of course, the problem this leads to is that you then have multiple manuscripts of the same text, let's just say the Gospel of John, for instance, and there are serious discrepancies between the different manuscripts. So which ones are most trustworthy? So what he wanted to do, what he wanted his scholars to do, he was not a terribly well-educated man himself, Charlemagne. He wanted his scholars to get together, compare these manuscripts, and try to create the most reliable manuscripts possible, the manuscripts that would be most true to the original, which in most cases was not actually available. So this was an important aspect of his educational reform. I should mention at this point that illuminated, that is, illustrated manuscripts were among the most important art forms of the early Middle Ages. And in your Art Across Time reading, which is really short, this unit, you'll see several examples of illuminated manuscripts from Charlemagne's reign. So I would invite you to look at the illustration of the four evangelists. This is Art Across Time, page 327. This would be a good example of an illuminated book that was produced during Charlemagne's reign. One of the things that's notable about this particular image is the way that it reflects Greco-Roman influences. If you look at the way that the evangelists are clothed, they are dressed like Romans, and there are elements of Hellenistic and Roman art here, in that you've got a kind of natural background, and there's some degree of depth that the artist is trying to create. So take a look at that as just one example. So to sum up, why am I talking about Charlemagne at all? One reason I'm talking about Charlemagne is because his reign is a good example of how the early Middle Ages is more than just warfare, brutality, starving peasants, all the kinds of images that we have in our minds when we think of the early Middle Ages. There's real, substantial, and exciting cultural achievements going on in the time of Charlemagne. But the second reason I want to talk about Charlemagne is if you look at Charlemagne himself, he is a very good illustration of all three of those strands of medieval DNA that I mentioned a moment ago: Germanic, Christian, Greco-Roman. So let's take the Germanic first. If you look at the image in Western World, page 210, there is a statue, bronze statue of Charlemagne. And you'll note that he does not look like a Roman. He is not dressed like a Roman, so he retained certain Germanic traditions, and I think that's significant. But you also, when you look at Charlemagne, you see just how important Christianity is for him and his kingdom. I talked about his relationship with the papacy. I could also mention the fact that he was a zealous, indeed overzealous evangelist of sorts, at one point trying to forcibly convert the Saxon people who were pagan to Christianity. I also mentioned his attempts to improve the literacy of the clergy. So he is someone who is very much committed to the Christian church and whose Christianity is a core part of his identity. Finally, there are a number of places where you can see the ongoing influence of Greco-Roman culture. You can see it in the art of the period, like that the four evangelists illumination that I mentioned a moment ago. You can look at his chapel that he had built for him in Aachen. You can find this in Art Across Time 325, and you'll see that it has some Roman qualities. It's, for example, a domed building. And I also mentioned that he styled himself emperor, and indeed, he thought of himself as sort of taking on the mantle of the Roman emperor. So he's kind of, in his own mind, reviving the Roman Empire. So you see all three of those facets of medieval culture, I think, very nicely illustrated in his reign. Now, again, there is another side of early medieval culture. After Charlemagne dies, a few decades after he dies, things really do fall apart in the Carolingian kingdom. His three grandsons sort of carve up the kingdom amongst themselves. There's a lot of infighting. Eventually, the Carolingian dynasty will fall. And really, sort of from the second half of the 9th century to the early part of the 11th century, we are dealing with a rather bleak period of Western history. This is the great age of invasions. You've got Viking invasions. In fact, there's a good map in West in the World, if I can find it, that shows you where all these invasions are taking place. Yes, page 219. So you can see the Vikings are fanning out from Scandinavia, really all over Europe, and causing a great deal of havoc and destruction. You've also got this group known as the Magyars, who eventually will become known as the Hungarians, because they were reminiscent of the ancient Huns of old. They're coming from sort of far Eastern Europe into Central Europe. You've also got Muslims in North Africa conducting raids in Italy and in what is now southern France, and so on. So there's a period of great political instability, and anytime you have a period of great political instability, of chaos, of violence and destruction, you can be pretty sure that it's not going to be one of the most culturally, educationally, artistically productive periods. And I think that is true of that period of time. All right, last thing I want to talk about in this video is early medieval society. I haven't really touched on that yet. How to characterize early medieval society. I think the best way to do that is to talk about two interlocking social systems. You're going to read about both of these. One goes by the name manorialism, and the other by the name feudalism. They are distinct systems, but as we'll see, there is a connection, there is a nexus between them. So let's start with manorialism. The first thing to say about medieval society is that the vast majority of people in early medieval society were engaged in agricultural work. Probably 80% of people or more. Most medieval people, therefore, lived and worked on a manor. A manor was an estate that was owned by a lord. Sometimes the lord lived there on the manor, sometimes he didn't. The lord could be a local aristocrat. The lord could also be a member of the church hierarchy. He could be an abbot. He could be a bishop. Look at the diagram on page 223 if you want to get some sense of what a medieval manor would have looked like. Living in the village on the manor would be the peasants who were engaged in the agricultural work. They would work a particular tenure of land and were able to keep most of the produce that they produced, even though the land technically, in most cases, belonged to the lord. They were able to keep most of the produce for themselves. By the end of the early Middle Ages, most peasants were also what we call serfs. Now, serfs were not technically slaves in the same way, when we think about slavery, we often think about antebellum slavery in the United States. This is different. Serfs were not the personal property of the lords. Nevertheless, in practical terms, in some ways, serfs were slaves because they did not have the freedom to move. They did not have the freedom not to do certain things for their lords. They owed their lords certain services. Let me mention a couple of those services. You'll see on that diagram on page 223 that there are certain strips of land that were the lord's strips. But the lord is not going to be out there with a hoe or a mule or whatever working that land. So one of the things that serfs had to do was spend part of their time working the lord's own strips of land, and then all the produce from those strips would go directly to the lord. These were called domain lands, spelled D-E-M-E-S-N-E. Okay. So that was the primary obligation that the serfs had, but there were other obligations besides. There were various fees and obligations. If you think that cable companies or cell phone companies are bad about sort of coming up with all these fees, medieval landlords were just as canny about this. So, for instance, if a peasant died, his family members would have to pay an extra tax to the lord to compensate for the loss of his labor. Or if a peasant's daughter married a serf who belonged to another manor, the father of the bride would have to pay the lord a fee because, again, he's going to lose labor. Now, landlords, early medieval landlords, didn't just need laborers. They needed something else. We have to remember that this is a period of time in which there is no such thing as organized law enforcement. So imagine you are a medieval landlord. What are you going to be worried about? You're going to be worried about being ransacked by bandits or, something like that. So landlords needed more than just agricultural workers. They also needed protection. And this is what brings us to that second social system, feudalism. Feudalism names the particular relationship between a landlord and a vassal. And the vassals were also known as knights. A formal agreement would be hatched between the lord and the knight. The knight would agree to offer a number of services to the lord. Chief among them would be military protection, but also things like giving him counsel and advice. And in return, the lord would give the knight what is called a fief, F-I-E-F. A fief is a kind of gift that has real monetary value, and in the Middle Ages, the fief usually took the form of land. So the lord would give the knight some land which very well may come with the labor of serfs. So you would not just get the land, you would also get the serfs who worked the land. Now, if you remember, I hope you do remember reading about ancient Roman society and the importance of patronage relationships. I just want to point out that feudal relationships are in many ways very similar to those Roman patronage relationships. There are four qualities that they have in common. These relationships are, first of all, asymmetrical. In other words, these are not relationships between equals. These are relationships where there is a clear superior party and an inferior party. The superior party we call the lord. The inferior party we call the vassal, V-A-S-S-A-L. The second quality of these relationships is that they are reciprocal. So each party has obligations that they owe to the others, not just a one-way street. Third, these were personal relationships. These were not seen as just sort of, business arrangements. There was a personal element as well. And then fourth, these are meant to be long-lasting relationships. You're not supposed to become somebody's knight for a year or two and then move on. These are supposed to be really sort of indefinite kinds of arrangements. Now, as you'll see, if you look at page 226 in West in the World, feudal arrangements can become rather complicated because one and the same person could be both the vassal of some great lord and at the same time a lord of another vassal. So just be aware that these relationships could get rather complex. The other thing to say is that both manorialism and feudalism, it's not like everybody in the early Middle Ages got together and said, hey, why don't we just set up society like this? These are social arrangements that were gradually gradually took shape over the period of centuries, really. But I'm talking about both of these social systems, manorialism and feudalism, in this lecture because it's really the Carolingian era, so 700s, 800s. It's really during that era that these social systems first appear on the radar, and they will continue to grow and evolve and be important in the High Middle Ages as well. High Middle Ages is what the next video will be about, so I'll see you then.